Welcome back to the Home Studio Pro podcast, where we're helping you create professional sounding music from your home studio. And today we have a very special episode because we're bringing in a true home studio acoustics expert. I love this stuff. I love talking about this stuff. I love thinking about this stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm just a guy who builds home studios for himself. I don't build hundreds of home studios or design acoustics for hundreds of home studios. But the person we're going to be talking to today, Graham Walks from City Acoustics, does exactly that. He has literally designed and implemented acoustic treatment into hundreds of home studios, professional studios, commercial properties, crazy amounts of stuff. And he understands this world because he was a home studio engineer himself at the start of his career, kind of naturally transitioned into this when he realized there was a need for it because he needed it. We'll get into that when we get into that part of the interview. But point being, this is going to be a very informative conversation for you, I think, because we try to keep it steered towards people just getting started with acoustic treatment or just trying to really get good quality acoustic treatment in their space, where to set it up, how to set it up, what's the right placement for it, how to think about scaling over time. It's the kind of thing that will help you improve your acoustic treatment if you already have it and help you come up with a good plan to scale over time if that's something you're interested in. Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with me and Graham Walks from City Acoustics. Hey, Graham. Thanks for joining me on this podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here.
Could you tell me a little bit about you? Where do you come from? How did you get into City Acoustics? How'd that come about?
Yeah. So it kind of started accidentally out of my need for acoustic treatment. I was a recording engineer and had a small studio that I was putting together here in Nashville, but also prior to that, when I was in college, had like a small studio in the house that we rented with a small control room and a small tracking room. And that was actually the first time that I built like any sort of acoustic treatment. And it was pretty much as bare bones, as simple and kind of down and dirty as it could get. And then when I moved out here, started exploring options just to buy stuff. And this was back in 2012. So like the options on the market were pretty different at that point in time. And so I ended up ultimately deciding to try and build it myself. I think a few things kind of just fell into place. There was an insulation supply company about a mile and a half from my house that sold 703 and sold rock wool.
That's helpful.
And that was super helpful. So it wasn't like, how do we find this material? And at that point in time, I really didn't know how to build anything, but it was like, I can figure this out. It's a rectangle, it's a wood frame, some fabric, some insulation. And so I got into it just out of ultimately my need to have acoustic treatment in my studio and not having a lot of money. And that was really kind of the foundation and still is a big part of what we do now, trying to create really high quality, affordable acoustic treatments. And, obviously 2012 was a while ago now. So several years have passed. And through that, I had moved to a house and turned that whole thing into a studio and then needed a lot more acoustic treatment and then built a lot more of it. And then slowly kind of started doing that on the side and turning it into more of a side business while I was engineering, making records. And through that, through having a studio and wanting to continually make my control room and my tracking room sound better, then kind of fell down the rabbit hole of like what really works for small room acoustics, what doesn't work. What are some of the challenges that like we really consistently see and some of the challenges of some of the products out there or how they're implemented. And then kind of the foundational aspect of what we do is how do you take all of those ideas and the things that were really challenging to make work well, and put that together into an easy to understand and kind of a simplified process of how to approach acoustics for studios and all sorts of spaces.
I love it. There's a couple things I want to draw people's attention to in there that I think separate you and City Acoustics apart from some of the other acoustic companies out there. The first is that you came up doing this. Like you were in our shoes of a home studio recording artist or engineer that was trying to make great sound music at home, realized the inevitable need for acoustic treatment. It's something that we can all pretend like we don't need, but eventually we got to get it, right? And
for sure,
you figured out how to build it on your own, kind of out of necessity, but also convenience. I don't think there's an insulation supply store near me. I can go to Lowe's and get some decently priced rock wool, but the selection's fairly limited. But so you had a good opportunity presented to you, and then you've continued to hone specifically home studio acoustics as kind of being at least a focus for City Acoustics. I'm sure you guys do well beyond that. I know you do, corporate and church stuff and all that as well. But there's an emphasis on home studio acoustics, which I think is important because it just is a little bit different than big studios, because the nature of small rooms, the way bass builds up, the fact that reflections have way more energy because the walls are so much closer, and
Yeah.
the kinds of things you're treating for are so much more. They're so much more specific in home studio. Not that it doesn't exist in a commercial studio or anything like that, but also we're seeing a trend, I feel like, in the industry right now where it's becoming more and more common for home studio or commercial studios or home studios to be turned into roughly a commercial studio. It's not uncommon. I mean, Andrew Masters has his little house now that is the entire house is a home studio,
Yeah.
and that's becoming a little bit more common, which I think is awesome and speaks to the fact that it's possible. It doesn't have to feel like it's impossible to get great recordings at home. It's more about a handful of things done well, which is what I'm all about at the Band Guide. So
Yeah.
it's awesome. I love it. And so
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, just to jump in there, I think like that's super true for Nashville, obviously. But I think
Mm-hmm.
where it's kind of like a full circle thing is that's not necessarily a new idea for Nashville. Like
Mm,
Music Row, I still remember the very first time I came to Music Row, 2011. I was kind of underwhelmed by it because it's like this is it. It's just like
yeah.
two roads and some buildings and some houses, but there was a lot of studios in houses, and whether they were like full on studios or publishing companies that had like spaces. There was the big buildings, obviously, and the bigger, more commercial spaces, but a lot of like the really well known commercial studios that made incredible records were in just houses, even back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so it is now kind of even more prominent, but definitely was always there, at least in Nashville, and certainly all over the country and all over the world now.
Yeah, definitely. I feel maybe it's more normalized is the word that's better than the way I was
Yeah,
describing it before. It's more the we understand that it's something that happens. I've seen. I mean, I know I live in Virginia, and Foo Fighters recorded their first major album, maybe it was their second actually, just at a house in Smithfield, Virginia, in a basement that wasn't huge. It was just a basement of a normal
yeah,
house in Smithfield, Virginia. I mean, there's nothing spectacular about that. Um, and they got an incredible sounding record. Well, the other side of it that I think is so important to draw attention to is this idea that we're definitely aligned on. We've gone back and forth on this already. That the importance with all this stuff is to distill it down to what really matters and focus on that at kind of a simplified form. We can all get lost in the weeds very quickly and it's maybe there's some nuance to the conversation that's maybe technically accurate, but like the amount that difficulty of conversation understanding benefits you, like how much more it's at maybe 1 to 10% edge as opposed to like 90% of the result with very simplified thinking.
yeah,
That's the way I think about it, at least. And at least starting out, people should be focused just on the simplified version of thinking of things. And then if they want to go down rabbit holes, they can. But if you just create an amazing 90%, what I think people don't realize is that would sound better than most things that exist in the recording world. Like if it sounds incredible, 90% incredible is really amazing. And so just focus on drilling in and nailing that simplified version as opposed to getting lost in the weeds of trying to get it, quote, perfect, which doesn't exist anyway. I mean, perfect as a concept it's like theoretically true, but there's no such
yeah.
thing as perfect.
Well, and I think the fun thing about acoustics, and also where it gets challenging and you can like totally fall down the rabbit hole of it is very much so rooted in physics and science,
Mm-hmm.
but it is also very subjective. And it,
Yes. Yeah.
from like the creative aspect of it, of like, hey, I need to record a vocal, or I need to record drums, or I want to mix and I need to make sure that this mix or this master translates. Well, what each person likes to hear is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And the spaces are going to be different. Like what really helps support that and supports that creativity and the art is going to be somewhat different to each person. That doesn't make the
Mm,
acoustic side of it more complicated. It just means there isn't like one perfect answer for everybody. It's like it's more flexible than that, and you get a little bit more control to kind of cater it and sort of form it to your taste and what really helps you create the best art and makes you the most inspired and the most productive.
definitely. Well, and you're never going to completely eliminate all acoustic issues in a room, especially a home studio room that the rooms are not necessarily designed to be perfectly, even across the entire frequency spectrum. And you don't have, 8 feet of bass trapping, all this stuff that makes it
Yeah.
difficult in home studio settings. But also that aspiration for totally flat, totally even is a little bit of a, what's the right word for it? It you're chasing after something that kind of doesn't matter, to your point of we don't necessarily love flat. So why would you go so hard after flat? You don't want to have big problems that are making it impossible for you to get a great recording, impossible for you to get a great mix if you have way too much of a certain frequency building up and you haven't accounted for that at least in your mind and how you understand what's going on in your room. And then potentially also inside the mix or inside the recording, then those are potentially going to be some issues. But overall, like having more low end, more top end, those kind of things, it gets so preferential, and creating a space that sounds good and feels good to you is kind of the first goal with this whole thing.
Yeah, and it depends on, what aspect of acoustics, or are you recording? Are you mixing? Is it just a listening room? Obviously, like for the purpose of this conversation, and I think your audience certainly, it's like more studio based or recording based, or mixing. But it's the biggest thing is never really like, can we make this room perfect, or like can it be totally flat? Because we're not super sensitive to that from like a frequency response standpoint. The biggest thing is making it balanced, and that just means you don't have
There
like
you go.
this huge peak and this big null. So like an area where there's no energy right next to an area where there's a ton of energy, because that's really hard for us to like hear and understand. And, in the low end, then it means you might not have any like oomph in your kick drum. It might not hit you in the chest, or if it's a big reflection off your desk, then you're going to lose some mid-range stuff, and then you lose the clarity in your vocals and in your guitars and any other instruments that you might have in your recording or in your mix. But I think for me and for our kind of approach to it, balance is always like the main goal. It's not like, is this room perfect? It's, is the room balanced? Can you learn it? Can you capture a really great recording in there to where you don't have too much, echo or reverb in it from the room, and just really finding the right balance of like what helps support the ultimate goal, which is creating music.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and you kind of segued us perfectly into what I think this would be a good place for us to focus this conversation, which is around the recording side of things. I feel like so much of the conversation around acoustics, because there's so much you have to do to treat a room for mixing, to get speakers to translate well in a space, or to present well, present evenly, where you know what's going on inside the actual mix and not just the room kind of lying to you about, the frequency response and all that stuff. There's so much information around that, and that's important, but I think we kind of lose the conversation around recording to some extent, or at least there's, 10 to 1 in terms of acoustic treatment conversations around the mixing side of things, getting your space set up optimally for recording or for mixing, and less about people who are just recording. Maybe they're mixing on headphones. Maybe they even have speakers, but they understand that they need to at least do some sort of balancing and checking on their headphones because their speakers are not necessarily perfectly set up. And especially in home studios, people often don't have the luxury of converting an entire room into their recording space, mixing space, whatever. So they might have to have their desk in a corner. They might have to, be kind of sequestered off into this little section of a room, or maybe they need a semi portable setup that they could bring out when they're recording and then tuck away into a closet. One example, and I think maybe a good starting point to have kind of a frame of reference for a home studio that my buddy, the singer in my band, records in. They live in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of DC, and so they have a townhouse. It's a beautiful home, but the basement is where his recording studio is, and it's also their guest room. And it's only, I would guess, maybe 7 by 11 feet, maybe 8 by 12 feet, something to that effect. It's a very small space, and I think the ceilings are only about 7 feet tall, and it sometimes needs to be a guest room. So they need to be able to tuck acoustic treatment away, things like that. And so I think focusing in on recording, what are the main considerations people should have to set up a great recording space? And then we could use that example or different examples if you'd like as to kind of specifically get into a frame of reference for people that are listening, trying to imagine it for their space.
Yeah, for sure. So I think it really comes down to like, what are you recording? I think the most common thing would probably be vocals, or maybe vocals and acoustic guitar. And vocals are actually in some ways, one of the more challenging instruments like to record at home, or one of the things to capture in a space that's not necessarily a studio, because you don't want a lot of reflected energy. You want to really hear, the sound of the vocal, what the mic's doing to enhance that, but not necessarily, sound bouncing around the room. So reverb, echo, that kind of thing. To control that, it's really just a matter of, can you set up a space? I think the first, probably most important part of this is I would avoid closets. So there's like this natural tendency to like go to a small space that is, you've got your close in it and there's less echo and reverb in it, and that can obviously be beneficial. But small rooms, particularly when they're not treated well for low frequencies or even like low mid frequencies, so 100 to 250 hertz, there's a lot of that energy in the voice, and it will just sort of bounce around, resonate within that closet, within those small rooms, because the resonances of smaller spaces tends to be in right in that range, and so you get really muddy,
Mm.
or you have the potential to capture really muddy recordings that you're going to try to really then start to notch out these EQs or sorry, EQ and notch out resonances and certain things that you don't want in the vocal, and so it can make it, you get less reverb and echo maybe, but much harder to deal with in the low ends and to really get it to sit well in a mix and blend in with your other instrumentation. So I think first and foremost, I would say in general, I probably would avoid small spaces like a closet, a 4 by 3 foot room, that kind of thing. Um, and then it's a matter of, if you have the ability to get acoustic treatment, it's more of a square footage kind of how much can you coverage at that point, or can you partition off a small section of the room to reduce how much energy is coming back to that microphone. And then I don't want to overcomplicate this, but there's a lot of factors like if you're recording a vocal, like what kind of mic are you using? So like
Mm.
I've got a dynamic mic here, it's an SM7. This rejects a lot of sound from around it. So it's pretty directional. It's a cardioid mic. Obviously, condenser microphones are going to be more sensitive. So you're going to hear more of that room sound. And then as you start to compress it, if it's, more of a pop vocal, you're going to hear more and more of that room sound. So we want to reduce the sound that's bouncing around the room. And, the easiest way to do that is with acoustic panels, porous absorbers. And then it's just kind of again, a square footage coverage area of like, can you get soft absorptive material in there to help contain that? And if you can't mount them on the wall, can you get a few things that are like freestanding to put around the microphone? Um, and it's one of those things I think for vocals, you don't need a massive amount of acoustic treatment, but you just need to kind of a few things to help control those things. And then obviously, if you're turning it into a professional studio or even a studio at home, but that you're just capturing all of the vocals and you're doing a ton of recording, you might want to do a little bit more to really fine tune those things. But I think the most important thing is just trying to find that right balance of can you capture a clean, direct sounding vocal without a ton of room sound in it.
Yeah, definitely. So a great point about the microphone selection. I think early on with the band guide, I definitely recommended condensers to everyone, and more, I think maybe a best first microphone for people recording at home is actually something like an SM7 or something in that family because of the nature. If you're in a untreated or less treated room, you're just giving yourself a leg up in terms of the amount of reflections that are going to be captured. And yes, they tend to be a little darker, they tend to be slightly less articulate, but they still sound amazing, and they still can perfectly capture a vocal for most genres and most, I mean, it doesn't have to be limited. So point being, I think that's a great first point. So the thing that I hear that if we drill into it a little bit more, so let's just take vocals, because I think you're right. That's probably the number one that people are thinking about. Probably after that, I think you're right, is acoustic guitar, because electric guitar, if you're using amp sims, you literally don't need to think about acoustic treatment. And if you're using a guitar amp, within reason, you have so much proximity to the source with the microphone, and there's so little, it's so directional. Point being, with a guitar amp, you don't necessarily have to think about acoustic treatment as much, potentially. So at least for a starting point, vocals and acoustic guitar, I think, is a great starting point for the conversation. Maybe we'll finish with drums for a self-serving person on this
Yeah.
call. But so for vocals, what how would you encourage people to position the panels to get the cleanest recording, the least reflections, and the least resonances from their room, which are kind of two different issues. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And then the second is, if people are buying or building panels, how thick should they be thinking when recording vocals, and then potentially acoustic guitar if it's going to serve? And would you recommend something different for minimum thickness for both of those two things? What are your thoughts there?
So I think start with the thickness or the depth of the panels. For recording and really any music related application, if possible at all, I would always go with like a 4-inch deep panel. So
Okay.
like for us, that's what we call our broadband panel. It provides really good even coverage across most of the frequency spectrum. It doesn't do a whole lot below like 100 hertz and some of the really low stuff, but for the purpose of like recording vocals or even acoustic guitar, it's going to cover just about the entire frequency range of those two instruments, and that will help reduce those resonances and some of the boominess, the muddiness that can otherwise happen and occur in those recordings. If that's not an option, and as I was saying earlier, it really is kind of a square footage game, like when you're trying to reduce how much of that room sound you have and how much of that reflected energy you have. Uh, like a 2-inch panel can work really well. If you're DIYing them, the easiest thing to make them out of probably is like Rockwell Safe and Sound that you can get out of Lowe's or Home Depot, any of like the big box stores, and that is typically 3.5 inches deep. So that's like a great DIY option. Um, and then, yeah, I think, either one of those will work really well. If you have the ability to go deeper, it from an acoustic standpoint, it's always better because it just gives you more even coverage. It covers, more of the low mid frequencies. They all work just pretty much, they all work equally as well at those higher frequencies and mid frequencies. And so the deeper the treatment is, the better, the more even it's going to be.
Okay.
Um,
With
there was
that,
another
yeah, how would you position? But on the same note of acoustic treatment, if you're mounting on the wall, if you suspend it off the wall and you have what's called an air gap behind the panel, you get better performance out of the acoustic treatment. But if someone is like, let's say you have 4 inches of total space that you feel like you could eat up into your room, is it better to go with a 2-inch panel 2 inches off of the wall or a 4-inch panel up against the wall?
So if you have 4 inches, that 4-inch panel with like 4 inches of insulation will work better.
Okay.
But the 2-inch panel mounted 2 inches off the wall will work significantly better than the 2-inch panel mounted directly on the wall.
Gotcha. And in that same vein, just thinking like if people go kind of the gobo route where they're taking their panels and making them a little more versatile, having them on stands or something like that.
Yeah.
Would a 2-inch panel going to operate at slightly better performance because it's kind of freestanding in the room, so there is that space behind it for air, or is that different once you're not necessarily like kind of 2 inches off the wall? The rule of thumb for people watching is basically the thickness of the panel off the wall for your air gap. So I'm curious if your what panel is 2.5 feet from the wall, your 2-inch panel is 2.5 feet from the wall, do you still get that same benefit, or does it benefit not come
Yeah.
the
So
same way?
that is that rule of thumb of like you want to match the air gap to the depth of the panel is a good one, but it is more so kind of as a way to prevent something else from happening.
Mm,
And so as you pull panels away from the walls, so essentially you make that air gap bigger. There will be a frequency at which the panels essentially become ineffective at. And so you've like kind of this narrow band where you're going to lose a lot of performance. Um, that, particularly from like a mixing standpoint, can be problematic. And that's where making the treatment deeper is beneficial. With tracking, you're going to be less worried about like direct sound going directly through the panel. So it becomes less of an issue. Um, so yeah, you can take a 2-inch or a 4-inch, more or less freestanding panel, a gobo, and kind of put it wherever you want in the room. And if you're close to it and you're tracking vocals, you're going to get really everything you need out of it. So
gotcha.
that's not an area where I'd say like, hey, you have to match the depth of this panel
Yeah.
to its air gap. That is much more of a how do you avoid a specific problem? And essentially, the bigger you make the air gap, the less effective they become in like the low mids or even like mid range. So like you'll see it if you run the math, like you take a 6-inch panel and you put it 2 feet off the wall, you continue to increase its low frequency performance, but then you're going to create a dip at its performance at like 300 hertz.
Mm,
And so it's just a balancing act and a trade off and making sure we're making, solid, informed decisions. And so that's where kind of the rule of thumb comes from, but it's not to say that you can't break those rules or change things. And so, we made a video on this room in particular when we built it out, or a whole series on it, and we had gobos ultimately like where the room and the frequency response of the speakers and the room itself was best was with those gobos probably 3 feet off the back wall.
mm,
Um, and that was to
interesting.
specifically target like 60 hertz. Yeah, there's kind of a trade off, higher up in the frequency response than of their performance, but not enough to be like, whoa, this is a problem. It's like, we really want to fix 60 hertz. How do we make that happen?
Yeah. So it helped you basically playing with that gap helped you fine tune the specific frequency response of those panels of the room.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this is a good point. Again, going back, this is where like kind of tracking and mixing. If you set up a room that sounds great for mixing, it will definitely be great or likely be great for most things recorded, right? I think that's a fair, as long as you're intentional about placement. Go
Certainly
ahead.
anything. Yeah, sorry to jump in, but yeah, anything that you want like a dry recording of,
Yes, yeah.
absolutely. Like a great mixing room is pretty much always going to be the best place to track vocals. Um, Acoustic guitar can benefit from, depending on what you want and how much control you want after the fact when you're mixing with like reverb and effects, or if you want, kind of everything built in and you want to capture stereo room sound, sometimes you might want more of a lively room for acoustic guitars. But yeah, anything like that, if you want a dry recording, a mix room's kind of the best place you could track it.
Yeah, because you're going to get that entire room fairly dead, fairly even across the frequency spectrum. So no reflections, no real buildup or nulling of frequencies for the most part within reason. But then tracking, you're you're not necessarily as focused on the entire room because you're trying to account for the way the speakers are going to bounce around the entire room and get back to your ears at your listening position and mixing. But with tracking, recording, you're just trying to make sure that what the microphone hears sounds great, or the microphones, depending on if you're, stereo tracking the acoustic or whatever. And so you can then play with positioning in a way that is more flexible, versatile, and I think it's to some extent listening is going to be the most important thing there, especially if you're playing with different acoustic treatment positions. But what are some good starting points, rules of thumbs in terms of placement of panels relative to what you're recording? So let's say if you're recording vocals, where would you position the panels to try to limit? And also in that same conversation, because I think it's easy to get lost in, we have to also think about ourselves in the room. So where's our best position, generally speaking, in the room, or at least a good starting point? And then where is a good place to think about acoustic treatment? Let's say if you have 2 panels, 3 panels, 4 panels, how would you think about placing those?
Yeah. So they're great question. And I think there's sort of this is the hard part with acoustics
Yeah.
is like there's always a lot of factors, which is why for us it's like send us I don't mean this to be like a plug, but it's like send us pictures and dimensions of your room so we can just draw it and be like, here's the best place to kind of start. And so um, we do a ton of that, and I try to draw everything. So I'm going to try to visualize this, which is definitely not my strong suit. Um, so I think like with if you're trying to capture a vocal in like your spare bedroom, and it's say like 10 feet by 8 feet, so small bedroom. Um, it really depends on like how many panels you have. So if you're starting with a really small number, I would put those pretty close to the microphone because that's going to give you the biggest impact for what the microphone's hearing. And that sort of is where I would deviate this into or kind of split this off into sort of 2 options. You've got one option where it's like a small amount of treatment and then another, and you're really going to focus on like spot treating one area, and that's going to be like where you stand or sit and where you put the microphone, and trying to reduce as much of those early reflections and the direct reflections that are getting into the microphone. And then the other option would be like, can you treat basically the room as a whole? You might still be treating it for tracking. So that might mean, high mid panels, just like 2 inches deep, but more even coverage across the room. And that's going to help reduce flutter echo and obviously the reverb. And then you're going to get, regardless of where you set up in the room, you're going to have less reflections and less reverb and less room sound. And so that approach would be basically you take the size of the room and just can you get a few panels, like 3, and I think a 10 by 8 room, you'd probably get like 3 panels on each wall and then a few on the ceiling. And that's going to give you really good even coverage. And the more even it is, the more efficient it's going to be. So you'll get less and less room sound as you add more panels. But if you only treat 2 walls and you put the same number of panels on 2 walls versus breaking those up onto all 4 walls, you're going to hear a lot more room sound because you still
Mm,
have 2 untreated walls that are reflecting that energy. So anytime we can break it up and spread it out across the room as much as possible, that's best case scenario. Obviously, if it's like also serving as your guest bedroom, that might not be an option. And so then we'd kind of go back to that first approach I was talking about, like how do you make this maybe say a corner? This is something that we've done a lot where we've got like a producer who tracks a lot of vocals, and even we worked with one person who was just like specifically a vocal producer. So it was like
mm-hmm.
we put a couple of panels above the desk in their room and then treated one corner with panels kind of flanking both sides of that corner and up on the ceiling. And so it's probably only 2 panels on each wall and maybe 1 or 2 panels above that area. And so if you're tracking vocals, this is where my visualizations can be terrible. So
Yeah.
like if I just pretend like my back was to the corner, essentially. And so then just panels, man, I'm terrible at this. Panels so like my left and right, but like diagonally, and then
Gotcha.
right above me. So there's no reflections off the ceiling. Because if you're tracking vocals and you're standing up and you're 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall, ceiling's normally the closest thing to you. So you don't want that coming straight back down
Yeah.
and getting into that. And then those side walls, you also want to treat, particularly, this kind of goes back to mic selection. If you're standing with your back to the corner and you've got a cardioid microphone, which I think we can probably safely assume 99% of people who are
Yeah.
recording vocals in the situations we're talking about will be on a cardioid microphone. So it's rejecting sound from the back of the microphone,
Mm-hmm.
but it's capturing everything in front of it. And so if my back's to the corner, if anything's reflecting off those walls, like directly, you know, behind me, it's going to come back into that microphone. And then even if there's sound coming back, hopefully this makes sense, but like you're singing out into the room, some of that energy is going to come back towards you. But if it's getting rejected from the back of the mic, it's got to reflect off those two walls again before it comes back to the mic. And so then you can kind of absorb that sound again. And so I think for like spot treating, I try to focus it in on a small area and really get the most out of it that way. So it's more efficient. And then if you can treat the whole room, sorry, I'm going to bring this back to the
Yeah.
short version of this answer. If you're starting with if you're only starting with like a couple of panels, really focus it in close to the microphone. And then if you have
Yeah.
the ability to treat the whole room, you want to spread that out as evenly as possible.
Okay. I love it. So I love this idea of a vocal booth corner, quote unquote. Like just basically taking maybe 3 panels, one in both sides of the corner,
Yeah.
and then one above you. And then one thing that I talk about a little bit is that think of yourself also as a little bit of a panel. Like if you have a little bit of that corner still exposed, but your body's now going to be blocking it, then you're getting just a little more coverage thinking of yourself in that picture. So you don't necessarily want to put them, I assume, edge to edge in the corner. Just spread them out so that
Yeah,
you're
they can come out a
also
little
capturing. Yeah. And then you're getting slightly more coverage. It's interesting. I've never quite had my head around, do you then sing into it, which feels more intuitive, like facing the corner, but you're saying no, face away so that the voice might go out into the room a little bit more, but what the mic's going to end up hearing is going to be less because what it's going to pick up is the reflected energy off the panels behind you as opposed to the sound bouncing all around the room behind you where the microphone's listening to. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
that is typically how I'd approach it. And I think,
Yeah.
there's the fun part of recording, I think, is getting to experiment. So I'm always like, if you can, try it. And, if they're free, that's the benefit of like freestanding panels too. And whether
Yeah.
it's just, you can, most, at least with ours, like they hang on the walls with French cleats. So if you wanted to take it down and just move it, literally all you have to do is like pick it up and set it down and put it wherever you want it to be. So you can experiment a lot with it and really fine tune those things.
Well,
But
then
that's also,
go ahead.
that's like the recording engineer in me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other side of that mindset is like most people that I have talked to about this, they want to get the benefits, but they're either nervous about the investment or they don't necessarily feel like it's worth it, or it's a little bit of an all or nothing. Do I have to get the $2,000 worth of panels just to get 12 panels around my room just to get baseline coverage? And I don't necessarily think that's true, especially starting out. I think you'd be better off having a cloud above, like, let's say your mix position. And then let's say, if assuming you're mixing, but even still, or your recording position, wherever, one cloud, one thing that's fixed to your ceiling so that you have a deader space relative to the floor to ceiling reflections. But then get 2 other panels that you can think of in a more versatile way. You could have them mounted, as you said, on the wall where they're always ready to capture reflections. But then you could also get the freestanding panels, like you guys have, I think, some stands that you could then take those panels into and stick them in, and then they could be basically like 6-foot-ish gobos, right? So you could
exactly.
functionally have 3 broadband panels, which is a few $100s, but it isn't. Or if people build them themselves, obviously it would be a little bit less, but there is the time that goes into building it. Having just finished this big wall behind me, I am reminded by, while it's fun to build stuff, it also is exhausting, and it's a lot more cuts. And if you're not someone who has already done a lot of DIY projects, while it's not a super complicated project, it's still a project, and you still have to make a lot of cuts and be fairly precise and all that stuff. Point being, I think DIY is great, but for a lot of people just getting started, I'd say buy a few panels, because then you also have a panel that you could look at as inspiration or kind of as a reference. At minimum, you should buy a few, in my opinion, so that you can see the way they're constructed in person, what they look like. And then maybe you'll want to go down the rabbit hole of just investing in acoustic treatment for the whole space. Or maybe you'll be able to get by with just 3 panels forever, and you didn't have to go through the hassle and figuring out how to build a panel and how to wrap it in fabric and make it look great and be functional. But point being, I think 3 seems like a great number for people starting out. You have one that's mounted from the ceiling, and then you have 2 that you could throw in the corner for recording vocals or something like that. And then you could do 2, then you could pull them off. And let's say you were recording acoustic guitar and you wanted to sit, you probably wouldn't use those same 2 in the same position that you had them for singing. You'd probably want to get them a little lower and closer to the acoustic. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, height's super important, if you're sitting down. So I think the height that we recommend, somebody install them depends on what they're doing in the room. And so,
Yeah.
and then also how tall you are can be a factor, because if you're super tall and you're standing up, you're going to want those panels to be higher up when you're singing. And then if you are recording acoustic guitar, when we sit, we're all at a pretty, or at least the guitar is at a pretty similar height, unless you've got an adjustable chair. And so, yeah, that can certainly be a big factor. You don't want them to be, oftentimes we've been in rooms where like there's already, there was already treatment involved or already installed, and somebody else had kind of designed it, or whatever the case may be. And it's like everything's 3 feet off the ground. And they're like, yeah, we track drums and acoustic guitars in here. And I'm like,
That's so
the
much lower to the
treatment's
ground.
above,
Yeah,
the treatment is
yeah,
above all of that. So it's not really doing the job. So the
yeah.
height's super important. That's not to say that like it always has to be adjustable. I think there's two things here that are super important. One, you were saying like it's not an all or nothing endeavor. And I think sometimes
Mm-hmm.
because there's just not that much that's like known about acoustics, and there has been for a very long time a lot of bad and information about acoustics and things that just like weren't super accurate, or maybe at times were kind of misleading. And that I think creates this sort of the unknown of it is like, wow, I got to do all of this at once, or it's not going to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry. Ultimately, I don't think that could really be like further from the truth, because if you start with an empty room, there's so much that can be improved. So you can get so much more clarity and accuracy and detail. And it's actually a lot harder to make a really big change once the room is well treated. And then you've got kind of that, like, the kind of a rule of diminishing returns, or that kind of idea there of like, the more you treat it, the harder it is to make a bigger improvement. But early on, like 3-4 panels can make a huge impact on the quality of the recordings. Particularly if you then, experiment a little bit and find like the best placement for them in your room. And that comes into a lot of factors like we were talking about before, like what microphone are you using and how loud are you singing? The louder you are, the more you're going to excite those things in the room, and the more reflections you're going to hear. And if you're on, sitting on your bed singing really quietly, you're going to have less energy coming back to you.
Yeah.
It still is coming back, but it's just signal to noise. And I feel like all of those things are probably overcomplicating this, but it really is just a matter of like just getting started and doing something when you don't have any acoustic treatment can make a huge impact right off the bat.
Yeah. And just to simplify that last point, because I think that is important, is you will notice the benefits, and you need it more the louder whatever you're doing is. So if you only ever whisper sing, you maybe could get by with no acoustic treatment, or just like singing with pillows around you. You might be totally fine. But most people are not doing that. They're at least at talking volume, which already in a small room, talking volume, there's so many reflections that come back and are getting into your microphones just at talking volume. So making it a deader space for that is going to give you a cleaner recording, which is going to make mixing easier. It's going to make the final result sound better in most cases, it benefits you across all areas. But I do think that volume to amount of treatment conversation, I think, is important. And it does extend also to mixing. If you don't have any treatment, one question I got from someone in advance is, if you have no treatment, what would be a good way to still mix with monitors, or can you not at all? And the answer to that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think is super quiet speakers and being real close to them so that you're hearing basically just what's coming out of the speakers. Not necessarily super quiet speakers, but quiet speakers.
So this is where the theory kind of falls apart. It doesn't really work the same in that regard. And I think the best way to probably describe this is, When you're like tracking vocals, there's
Yeah.
sort of two things going on here. So, one, like I'm really close to this microphone.
Yeah.
So it's really more of a proximity thing of like how much of the direct to reflected
Mm.
sound are you capturing? And then the louder I am, the more you're gonna like the higher the volume of those reflected the reflections are gonna be. The other caveat is like as you were talking, you're saying like the louder it is, the less important it is. Or
Oh
sorry,
no,
the
I
more
said,
important. Sorry,
yeah, yeah.
you said the more important it is. But we are also saying earlier that like you don't necessarily need to treat the room really well if you're tracking electric guitars through an amp, and
Mm.
those can be
That's a
super
good
loud.
point.
But that is for a different reason, and this is where like the speaker thing kind of falls apart. It has a lot more to do with like how much transient information is there in what
Mm.
you're recording and how often is it starting and stopping and what's the decay of the instrument. And so with vocals, if you stop singing and you're recording them and you want to then later on go add reverb and effects, you don't want to then hear the room sound in your recordings with with an electric guitar, unless you're recording something that's like super chimey and really rhythmic. That's less likely to happen. If you're just strumming along playing chords and it's big and loud, particularly if it's distorted, you're not starting and stopping a lot. And so that's where like clapping in a room is not a very good way to evaluate, certainly from like a
Yeah.
mixing standpoint. Is
Yeah.
this a good mix room? But it is a good way to hear like just how much of that reflected energy are you hearing? Um, and
So
that's
that's
super
getting more to like
transient.
decay time. Basically,
Yeah.
like how much does the sound continue to bounce around the room in an obvious way if there's very little treatment or no treatment? Um, because and so a louder source with more proximity, but uh, with little to no like hard like clappy type like start and stop transient heavy things, super rhythmic transient heavy things means that there's less space in between for you to, or no, means that there's more space for you to perceive the room. Is that kind of,
Yeah, there's more space
yeah,
for you to perceive the room, and then what it's going, what it's going to actually do and impart on the recording is going to be more noticeable. And I think bringing this back to your question about speakers is yeah, if you listen at lower volumes and you're really close to them, you're going to hear that ratio of direct to reflected sound is going to be lower. That has less to do with the volume, it has more to do with how close you are to it. And so, but where it doesn't really hold true or falls apart more is like your room. Sorry, I know it's like our thing is acoustic simplified, and then
yeah,
I start
yeah.
talking, and it's just like here's all this
Well, it's
chaos.
so hard when
Um,
you
but
know it and love it.
yes, so and I get too excited about it.
Yeah.
But essentially, like if you there's a curve called the Fletcher-Munson curve, and it's just it
Yeah.
kind of outlines like how we hear and when we're most sensitive to certain frequencies. So at
Hmm.
lower volumes, we're not very sensitive to low frequencies. Um, your room is just as sensitive to low frequencies at low volumes. So like the room modes, the
Mm.
resonances, the standing waves, the things that like the distortion that's actually happening in your room at really low volumes isn't really any different at really high volumes. Those things are still happening. We are technically less sensitive to it, so you might have a harder time picking up on it or noticing it. But if you don't have any treatment in your room, I would say yes, low volume is a very good way to go. Um, but also being closer to the speakers is going to be better because you're going to have more of the direct sound and your speakers are really quite well balanced. um so sorry, that's a very long
Yeah.
tangent, but
No,
more it's more of a proximity thing to your speakers than it is like a
the
volume thing,
volume.
but there is a benefit to the volume because of how we hear, but it's not really acoustic related.
Okay. So basically, in short, if you're mixing a room with little to no treatment, you want to mix at a fairly low volume, but more
Yeah.
importantly, you want your speakers. You don't want to have them 5 feet wide. For people who don't know this, for speaker placement, generally speaking, you want to create an equilateral triangle for your sweet spot, and so you don't want to have them 5 feet wide and then need to be nearly 5 feet away from them to hear it. You probably want a narrower placement, and you're closer to the speakers, and so the whole thing is tightened up, and you're hearing very clearly, very directly what's coming from those speakers and not the speakers bouncing all around the room.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's helpful. And also, yeah, we got in the weeds with that. But I think the takeaway, and actually what I would go back to is, hey guys, don't do it. Just mix on headphones and only think of your speakers as something that you check on and you're not relying on as your main source, because it's so complicated to get it right, especially if you're starting out and you are struggling in general, focus on headphones. This is a point that I make. My personal stance on this is everyone should learn to mix on headphones because it will always benefit you forever. It's always going to be, if you understand a pair of headphones extremely well, then when you move houses and you need to set up your new room and your room makes it sound a little bit different if you're mixing on speakers as well, you now can check on your headphones and you'll be able to tell that difference much easier. It's going to benefit you forever. So just learn to mix on headphones, and then you can mix on speakers too, but let that be a longer term thing that you scale up to, if you will. That's my stance on it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think going back to like the all or nothing theme,
Yeah.
to get, if you want to get the low end like perfect or really dialed in a room, that's going to take a lot of treatment. But like to get really good stereo imaging, to have really good depth of field for your mids and your high frequencies, you can do that without a ton of treatment. And so that you can, pretty quickly work up to that. And I think acoustic treatment is a thing that we tell people all the time is like, you can do this in phases. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
treat the whole room at once and be like, it's all going to be useless if I don't do that. It's really not that way at all. It's like if you just put in a cloud, like you're going to notice a big improvement. If you treat the sidewalls and those early reflection points, you're going to notice a big difference. And you can, really incrementally do those things the same way that you'd buy preamps or compressors or guitars and, whatever the case may be. It's not like, you don't have to do everything all at once to get a huge benefit out of it. And it is kind of the thing that makes, if you do buy a lot of preamps or a lot of guitars and other things, every time you improve the acoustics of your room, whether you're recording and mixing, it really does improve and allows you to get more out of every one of those other tools that you do have in your toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. I've tried to figure out how to articulate this, which is, and I've actually, now that I think about it, I think I've heard Yesko talk about it, which is basically think of acoustic treatment as you need to put it into your toolbox. People need to not think of it as like, I'm going to wait, I'm going to do an amazing acoustic treatment. Put it into your toolbox early with less while your skills are lower. And as you continue to improve, it's just one more thing that you also continue to improve along with everything else. Like the same, as soon as you're thinking about getting a new microphone, it's maybe a consideration. Well, would that benefit me, or would 3 more panels benefit me more? And make a little bit of that analysis, but always be thinking as you are upgrading gear, it's just one more piece of gear. So one more tool that you should continue to upgrade. And there's a cap on that. You don't need to have infinite treatment, but at some point, like, for example, just to say, like, you could get to a point where you have enough absorption, but then you want to start thinking about diffusion and things that might bring you a livelier sound in the recording space in particular. Or if you are if you now have an extremely dead room and it feels uncomfortable to be in, maybe you want a little bit of scattering or something like that just to make it feel slightly livelier in a way that is more acoustically appropriate. That's probably beyond the scope of this conversation, but just point being, it can be something that continues to be a part of your thought process even once you've acoustically treated the absorptive wise plenty for your space. You still have space that you can go with it. So it's something that just keep it in your arsenal. Think of it as a tool. Don't feel like you have to do all of that now. But as we said, you could get 3 panels and have them, if you are mixing them, have them to the left and right of you so that it's capturing the first reflections off the wall. If you are mostly just recording, have them kind of in a corner with a cloud above you where you're getting a really tight vocal recording. And then if you want to come over and record acoustic guitar, and that's actually maybe the last thing that I want to ask you about here, is how would you position those panels? Let's say you take them off the wall to get them in a better position with either feet or with stands or something like that for acoustic guitar. How would you position them for that? Would it still be behind you? Would it be behind the guitar? Like height wise, assuming you're sitting, how would you think about that or recommend people think about that?
Yeah, I think acoustics tend to be a little bit easier because you don't have as much of that kind of staccato transient response to them typically, for most things at least. And the instrument itself resonates more. So that relationship of like the direct to reflected sound isn't quite as critical as it can be with a vocal. So placement wise, I think for the most part, where they are for your vocals is going to work pretty well if you sit in a similar spot. Particularly if you're cognizant of that when you go to install your treatment and you find kind of the best balance of what's the height that I'm going to be at when I'm recording vocals and what's the height that I'm going to be at when I'm recording guitar. So if you kind of can think through that ahead of time, you may not have to move them at all.
Nice.
If you are going to move them, you might just kind of, I don't think from that corner setup that we were talking about, I would probably move them. If you're going to sit kind of in that corner, things should work really well. If you're going to move out into more to the middle of the room because you want more maybe say you want more of like a room sound as a whole, um, then I might put them kind of like if I'm sitting here playing guitar, a couple feet in front of me in each direction, just to sort of create more. That's going to let you create more of a little bit of a separation between some of that direct and reflected sound potentially, depending on, again, what microphone you're using. That just will allow there to be a little bit more focus and clarity, but still have some of that sound coming back into the microphone, so you do hear some of the room sound. If you don't want to hear any of the room sound, the closer you bring those panels into the microphones, closer proximity to the microphone or microphones, the less of that you'll capture, and so you can play around with it that way as well. But try to keep it, ultimately keep that as simple as possible. And I think one thing, as you were talking, sorry, just to jump back to this, of like, you know, treating your room in phases and then diffusion later on, and kind of, all the different options are, so much of our focus is on like helping people figure out what's going to work best in their room based off of how they're using it and the size of the room and the budget of the room, the budget that they have for acoustic treatment. And so like we've got a free room advice form on our website. And it's just like for the sake of like, hey, what do you actually need, or what's the best option for me? It's hard to figure out. Like,
Yeah.
obviously we're talking through these things, but there are a lot of factors. And so I just want to point out, like, we're very much so here to help people figure that out. If
Yeah.
they're not
So
sure, they're not like, they've listened to this and they're like, I'm just totally, this is worse than it was
yeah,
before, and I'm
yeah,
lost
yeah.
because this guy talks way too much. We do have like a free room advice form that we have on our website, and it really is just there for people to help them figure out what's the best way to treat their room if they're tracking vocals or guitars or doing all of the things and mixing.
Yeah. Uh, okay. Tell me. So you guys have a free advice. Let's just talk about that a little bit more, because I think that's a great kind of rounding up for this conversation. So if people are interested in working with Music City Acoustics, you guys have a free advice form. You can tell me. You can submit basically some information about your room, your budget, and what does that process look like if someone sends that in? What do they expect after
So it's
that?
basically the process is if somebody's like, hey, I would love to get help actually figuring out what treatment I need for my room, because this is a big scary thing.
Yeah.
They can send us pictures of their room along with dimensions of the room, and then we'll build out a 3D model of it so we can show them, where the acoustic treatments would go and which acoustic treatments we'd recommend for the space. And then typically we'll put together like 2 or 3 designs so they can see if they were going to treat the room in phases over time, like we were talking about, or if they're like, hey, this looks awesome, let's just do it all at once. They could, obviously see what that looks like as well. But we really focus on, figuring out what's unique about each situation. So what's the size of the room? What are they using the room for? What is the budget, and what are the goals? And how do we take all of that information and really put together the best designs and recommendations that are going to have the biggest impact for however that room and is being used and whatever the goals are.
Awesome. And do you guys ship internationally, or is that really just for the U.S. at the moment?
We don't ship internationally. So we
U.S.
can't
based people.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's just like acoustic treatments. There are some good companies that make acoustic treatment products, and it tends to be kind of regional, kind of country by country, just
Yeah.
because they're not
Expensive to
super
ship, right?
expensive products,
Yeah.
and they're very big and heavy, and just like the shipping cost on them internationally gets crazy.
Sure.
So I'd love to be able to ship them all over the place.
But it just doesn't make
But
sense.
it just doesn't really make sense. And
Yeah,
it's
for
ultimately
sure.
doesn't make sense, um, for whoever's looking to treat their room, because it's just like you'd spend so much money on shipping.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so for people in the U.S., definitely take advantage of that form. It sounds like a great way to get kind of that long-term vision, so that you're intentionally buying what you can afford in your budget right now, but also you have a bit of a vision for, if I were to continue to grow in this space, or not if, you will continue to grow. So as you continue to grow with this, if you need more acoustic treatment, you'll have a vision of what that looks like to continue to grow with your resources, and it will scale over time. So you don't have to invest $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, whatever it might be, just on acoustic panels at the start. You could do it with a more modest setup that then scales up over time. And kind of just a thought that I have about y'all's pricing and pricing for acoustic treatment in general. I think you guys have really great prices, and that's something you highlight, that if you're in the US, I think your prices are better than buying from big corporate panels that are probably too thin. And more importantly than that, I think if you're coming at it from a DIY approach, if you have the time, if you're not going to do a lot of acoustic treatment, you'd only save a little bit of money by going DIY, but you'd have to get all the tools to do it or set yourself up to do it. If that's not something you already are in the habit of, I think going the route of buying acoustic treatment makes total sense. As I said earlier, at least get started, get something, because the longer you don't have it, everything that you do is negatively impacted to some extent by not having it. You can't get that acoustic treatment into your recordings after you've recorded them. So getting it set up, getting going, and having that long-term plan, I think makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah,
awesome.
For sure.
Well, Graham, thank you so much. It's been a real fun conversation. Obviously, I think we're kind of nerds about this stuff. So while we may have the goals of simplifying this, hopefully we didn't confuse people too much. If you did, though, again, go to musiccityacoustics.com and check out their free advice form. And yeah, awesome. Thanks, Graham.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Definitely check out Music City Acoustics at musiccityacoustics.com. And if you are working on setting up your first home studio and trying to make it easy for you to create professional sounding music in, or just upgrading the studio that you currently have to make it work better for you and help you get better results, I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a completely free Home Studio Pro checklist that you can grab from the link in the description below or at thebandguide.com/Home Studio Pro checklist, all one word. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave a review, and I'll see you next week in another episode.
One thing at a time, I can only